Chapter 25, the Civil Rights Movement, the late 1950s, the 1960s, and the early 1970s. In 1896, the Supreme Court ruled in a case called Plessy versus Ferguson that separate but equal was constitutional. In the South, however, colored and whites, waiting rooms, schools, facilities were separated by law. In the North, it was separated by custom and tradition. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, began to challenge the laws in court. The Congress of Racial Equality, CORE, founded by James Farmer and George Hauser in 1942, began to use the sit-in protest movement to desegregate northern restaurants and theaters, and they fought racism. In 1954, another Supreme Court case came called Brown versus Board of Education, and they challenged the ruling that separate was equal, because it was not, especially in the South. Linda Brown's parents said segregation in schools was unconstitutional and it violated her 14th Amendment rights. There was a famous test done with some dolls. They had just two plain dolls, but one was light color skin and one was a brown color skin. And they asked a group of African American children which one was prettier, and each one picked the light color skin. And they used this argument to say that we were taking a whole generation of people and making them think that their race was not beautiful when it is. All races, all ethnicities, everybody should have equal rights and should feel secure and happy about who they are. Thurgood Marshall was one of these lawyers, and he becomes the first African American Supreme Court justice. However, it's not really until 1969 that schools were fully integrated. So how's it start? Well, it starts with Rosa Parks. One day, and she wasn't the first one, but it just was the right time, and there was a spark, and she said, you know what, I'm not giving my seat up on the bus, I'm tired, and she was arrested. This starts a bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama, and at that time, a 26-year-old pastor, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., had just become a pastor in Montgomery, and they asked him to lead this movement. In 1956, Alabama's Supreme Court ruled that segregation on buses was unconstitutional and against the law, so they did win. Now, Martin Luther King is right here. A lot of his ideas come from India, Mohandas Gandhi, who used a lot of nonviolent protest techniques to get the British out of India. So Dr. King started SCLC, or the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, to challenge segregation in registering to vote, public transportation, housing, and accommodations. At this time, President Eisenhower, who was general in World War II, was president. He ordered Navy shipyards and veteran hospitals to desegregate, and in 1957 had to send the Army to Little Rock, Arkansas High School, Central High School, when 9 African American students were banned from attending by Governor Orville Fulvis and the Army National Guard. 1,000 Army troops were at the school, and many of them remained there for the rest of the school year. Here's some pictures of that. In 1957, Congress did pass the Civil Rights Act. It was supposed to guarantee everyone the right to vote. However, it did not. There was still rampant racism, especially in the South. At this time, a girl named Ruby Bridges wanted to attend an all-white Southern elementary school, William Frantz Public School in New Orleans, Louisiana. And at that point, the Brown versus Board of Education case had been heard, and she should have been allowed to go where she wanted to go, but she was blocked, unfortunately. And so they had to send federal examiners to walk her to school. And here's some information about that. And I want to show you this painting. So this is a famous painting by Norman Rockwell, and this is supposed to be Ruby Bridges walking to school. Notice the federal examiners, it says that on their sleeve. She's small because she's only in, I forget what it was, 2nd grade or something like that. They're throwing tomatoes at her. There's a word there I don't want to say. Nobody should be saying that word because it is a racist word, but he's trying to prove a point that, this cannot be, this can't stand. Look at this poor little girl. And if you noticed, a phoenix is supposed to represent a rebuilding or rebirth, and the tomato that they threw is supposed to be a phoenix, if you can see that. Okay. There is a Disney movie about her story. In 1960, college students began to sit at Woolworth counters, lunch counters in Greensboro to demand a cup of coffee. Some of them were denied service because they were African American, and others were denied service because they were with other African American students. Within 2 months, there had been 54 sit-ins. However, they all remained nonviolent. And here is a picture of one of the sit-ins. At this time, SNCC was created by Ella Baker, Marion Barry, Fannie Lou Hamer, and John Lewis, who just recently passed away. And it was basically the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And it was college students that were going to make decisions about how they were going to protest and what they were going to protest. They decided they were going to protest interstate busing. And when you got off the bus, many terminals in the South had separate waiting rooms and separate bathrooms. And they were going to challenge this because in 1946, the court ruled that this was illegal. Now, as they did this, there was a lot of violence, unfortunately, and a lot of these poor peaceful protesters were beat. One bus was actually lit on fire. It was a miracle nobody died in that fire. President John F. Kennedy, who was president at the time, promised to support civil rights, and his brother Robert Kennedy used his influence to get Dr. King out of jail in Georgia after a protest. And JFK named 40 African Americans to important government positions, including Thurgood Marshall as the first Supreme Court justice. The ICC was created to regulate bus terminals, and at this point, James Meredith, an Air Force veteran, had wanted to attend University of Mississippi. The problem was he was black, and so he was denied the right to go, and so the government has to send in the federal marshals to escort him to school. In April 12th of 1963, King is arrested again during a nonviolent protest, and he writes a whole book called Letters from a Birmingham Jail, where he says to the white moderates, you can't just sit around and say, well, I'm not racist, you have to do something. And that segregation was draining blacks of their self-respect, and this had to change. Dr. King is released from jail, and in May 2nd and 3rd, they have what's called the Children's March. And Bull Connor, who was the commissioner of police, bring out fire hoses, which are very dangerous and should never be used on people, dogs, clubs on these poor teenagers and young college students. Here are some pictures of that. Here's the fire hoses, very dangerous. You should never do that. The dogs, it just was a mess. Kennedy proposes a Civil Rights Act, but it gets stalled in Congress. And Martin Luther King will have a march on Washington, D.C., where he'll give his famous I Have a Dream speech. If you haven't heard that, make sure you look that up on YouTube. President Kennedy, however, was killed. He was assassinated on November 22nd of 1963 in a parade in Dallas, Texas. So the Vice President, Johnson, becomes the new president, and he is good at getting Congress to do things, and so he's able to get some civil rights laws passed. The 24th Amendment eliminates any poll tax, which means a tax to vote. The problem is 24 black churches are attacked in Mississippi to stop blacks from voting. In 1964, King wins the Nobel Peace Prize and organizes a march at Selma, Alabama. There is a whole movie about this. When the protesters come at the end of the bridge, they are clubbed and beat. It was a disgrace. 70 African Americans are hurt, and it's nicknamed Bloody Sunday. And Americans are stunned by what they see. They see peaceful protesters just walking and being beat. President Johnson goes on TV to propose a voting rights bill and a civil rights bill. And Freedom Summer becomes popular among college students. Many college students say, you know what? we're going to go down to the South and we're going to register people to vote and we're going to help them vote. However, 3 of the college students were killed. They were murdered. 1 black college student, 2 white college students. New civil rights issues. Well, by 1965, peaceful protest isn't working. So riots start, especially in Watts, Los Angeles in California. And as you see, same kind of issues that we're talking about today. Okay, but luckily today we have more different kinds of people that are protesting. It's not just one group. Everybody's trying to get things changed. Riots break out in Detroit, Camden, Newark, and poverty and racism are big topics. The Chicago movement is started to bring attention to slums and deplorable housing conditions, and the Black Power movement starts. The Black Power movement is not about violence, it's about using violence if needed. They want to change, they want changes in schools, law enforcement, and housing. Malcolm X is sort of one of these Black Power movement people. He starts his own group, and he advocates self-defense is needed. He joins what's called the Nation of Islam, and he goes to Mecca, which is a very holy city in the Middle East, and there he decides that, you know what, blacks shouldn't have to live with whites, they should be separate, but should still have equal rights and equal facilities. However, somebody in his own organization assassinates him. So Malcolm X, unfortunately, is assassinated by another black Muslim. The Black Panther movement is created by Huey Newton, Bobby Seale, and Eldridge Cleaver. They arm themselves not just for revolution, but to get people what they need, to get kids after-school care, to get kids what they need for to be successful in school, to help mothers who need food for children, things like that. So they're not just a violent group by any means. They are there to help people and only use violence if needed. In 1968, King goes to a protest in Memphis, Tennessee to support a strike of sanitation workers. He gives his speech, and the next day he is assassinated while standing on the balcony of his hotel. More than 100 cities face riots, and the civil rights movement seems like it's just going to fall apart. A Civil Rights Act of 1968 is passed for fair housing and rentals, and eventually things get better, but the problem is things have never changed 100%. We've changed maybe about 50%, and we still have some things that need to be changed, as you know, from watching the news and from listening to Black Lives Matter and from just, being around and seeing what needs to be changed. Here is, unfortunately, a picture of King. He had just been shot, and they're pointing to where the gunshot came from. And this is King over here. What are the results of the civil rights movement? Segregation is illegal. African Americans do gain voting rights. African Americans begin to serve in politics and government. Jackie Robinson becomes the first black player in the Major League Baseball League. Can't see that part, it kind of came out. And that is the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, chapter 25.